classes, because these are some incredible capstone students and the work that they've done today. So you're really going to enjoy this. Before we begin, I'd like to invite Professors Nellie Khalil, Director of our Office of International Education, and Michael Bentley, our Coordinator of Social Justice Studies, to say a few remarks before we begin with our first student presentation.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm not going to say a lot of words. Two reasons. One is I'm having wisdom tooth pain, and the other is I always get emotional. The students who take part in the Capstone program. It's very easy to come to Hartford, just go to class, get your grades, and move on. But you all are so engaged and so determined to make a mark and change the world. And that really, really inspires me, keeps me coming to work. Oh.
I have to say, I'm getting old and my memory's fading. But we're, again, as Professor Bentley mentioned, thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited to see our first set of presentations this week. We have another set next week. But this is really a significant milestone for the students in our STAGE program, which includes both the Global Scholars and Social Justice Studies distinction students. It's the culmination of a lot of hard work, dedication, and a lot of leadership. And our students are definitely talented and leaders across campus. And it's evident through the work that you'll see today, but also in other arenas as well. Through their work, students have embraced ideals of global citizenship, social justice, and sustainability, and they've served as catalysts for positive change within our community and beyond. We wish to thank the students for all their hard work. And again, as Professor Bentley mentioned, I'm in awe of you all. I'm very inspired by your determination, your focus, and your efforts toward global justice, sustainability, and breaking down barriers. I mean, I feel very hopeful for the future when I see the work that you do. Also, we want to thank the faculty mentors who have helped to provide support for our students over the course of the semester. They worked on their capstone projects. And thank you to family and friends that are here today. As you know, communities of support are really kind of the foundation for people to be able to do exemplary work like our students. So thank you.
So I know we got a honors convocation right after this, so we're going to try to keep the pacing, but we'll have 4 student presentations this evening. Please be aware that we are recording the sessions over here, so just keep that in mind. We will ask you to refrain from asking any questions during the student presentation. We hopefully will have some time after each presentation that if you do have some questions, you can ask them at that time. Also, if you do need to leave the room at any point, please do so in between the presentations, not during the presentations. Okay, great. So we're going to begin with our first presentation of the evening, and we'll have Dechen come up to give her presentation. She's a candidate for Global Scholars. It's all set up. Okay.
Alrighty. Hello, everyone. My name is Dechen, and today I will be presenting on China's transnational repression of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers. As a Tibetan American and as the president of the Chicago chapter of Students for Free Tibet, I have witnessed firsthand the relentless suppression of dissenting voices, including friends and fellow activists, by the Chinese government. And during the APEC summit protest against dictator Xi Jinping back in November 2023, so just about, oh God, it's already May, like, I can't do math, 6 months ago. Yeah, during that APEC summit protest in November, when Xi Jinping came to San Francisco, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Chinese dissidents, and allies all came together, engaging in their fundamental rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and speech. And they were met with orchestrated and outright violence by CCP counter-protesters. And this episode of violence that was inflicted upon our community activists signifies a marked escalation of China's transnational oppression tactics. And therefore, it is imperative that we shed light on these injustices and advocate for the rights of all affected communities. I will begin by providing a brief overview of transnational repression at large and its significance, and then exploring the current state of repression and human rights violations under Chinese rule within Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong. And I will then examine the tactics and methods used by the Chinese government to suppress dissent among these communities living abroad, and share insights and perspectives from interviews I conducted with youth activists from each of these communities, again, from the Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Kong freedom movements. All right, so transnational repression, as defined by Freedom House, an independent human rights watchdog, refers to government's actions to suppress dissent among diasporas and exiles beyond their borders. So not just within the territories of Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong, but also targeting activists and dissidents in other countries and even in democratic countries as well. And this includes a range of tactics such as assassinations, illegal deportations, abductions, digital threats, Interpol abuse, and family intimidation. Understanding and addressing China's transnational repression is crucial for several reasons. Firstly, it highlights the lengths to which authoritarian regimes will go to maintain control of the press dissent, even beyond their own borders. Secondly, it sheds light on the human rights violations and threats to democracy faced by targeted communities and individuals, emphasizing the urgency of international solidarity and action. And lastly, it underscores the broader implications of China's growing influence on global governance and human rights norms. However, before delving into China's repression beyond its borders, it's crucial to understand the gravity of the situation within Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong, where severe human rights violations and suppression of dissent are rampant under Chinese rule. So first with Tibet, and it has, right now, the Chinese government is in the process of trying to rename it Xisang, which is like Western Treasure Box, to erase Tibet off the map, which they've already done, but also erase it from history as well by replacing the name. And Tibet has been under Chinese control, unfortunately, since 1950, following a military invasion by the People's Liberation Army, and it is currently ranked by Freedom House as the least free place on the world under China's legal occupation. Since then, approximately 1.2 million Tibetans, about 1/5 of our population, died due to China's policies. And thousands of Tibetans were forced into exile, including my grandparents, around 59. Additionally, many Tibetans languished in prisons and labor camps, and over 6,000 monasteries, temples, and cultural buildings were destroyed with their contents pillaged. And this is happening even today. I don't know if you've all seen the recent news in Tibet about a hydropower dam being built in Dechen, but this has displaced over 10,000 Tibetans that have been there and are ancestral indigenous to that land, and also destroying more of their monasteries or kumbas that are very meaningful to them. And today, Tibetan language, culture, and religious practices are systematically suppressed by Chinese authorities, and Tibetans continue to face the brutal consequences of China's colonization, environmental degradation, and cultural genocide of Tibet. The following is a quote by a headquarters member of SFT, or Students for Free Tibet, that encapsulates the situation. Via transnational repression, China is attempting to export their authoritarianism overseas. In Tibet, China has criminalized being Tibetan. To express Tibetanness through language, through culture, through religion is punishable in Tibet by arbitrary disappearance, torture, and death. China is trying to criminalize being Tibetan even overseas. East Turkestan, also referred to as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but Xinjiang is also the Chinese given name to East Turkestan, or occupied East Turkestan. It is home to Uyghur ethnic minority and other Turkic Muslim groups. And unfortunately, the region has also faced increasing repression by the Chinese government, particularly since dictator Xi Jinping took power in 2012. And the Chinese government has implemented a widespread surveillance system, arbitrary detention of Uyghurs in internment camps, forced labor programs, and systematic suppression of religious and cultural practices. Reports by the United Nations indicate that over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in this region have been detained in what the Chinese government describes as vocational training centers, but what is actually mass internment camps or concentration camps. And Hong Kong, which was a former British colony, was returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 under the One Country, Two Systems framework. And in recent years, there has been growing concerns over Beijing's encroachment on Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. The situation escalated in 2019 with the introduction of a proposed extradition bill, which would have allowed individuals to be extradited to mainland China for trial, which sparked mass protests with millions taking to the streets. Despite the bill being withdrawn, Beijing imposed a controversial national security law in June of 2020, bypassing Hong Kong's legislature, which criminalizes acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. And this has also been widely criticized for undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. And very recently, the enactment of Article 23 legislation further exacerbates concerns over the erosion of human rights in Hong Kong and introduces draconian measures such as expanded sedition laws, mandatory reporting requirements, extended police powers, and restrictions on legal rights for detainees. Now, going back to transnational repression, the Chinese government, like many other authoritarian regimes, employs a range of tactics to suppress dissent among dissenters, but specifically among Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers living abroad. And these tactics can be categorized into direct attacks, long-distance threats, mobility controls, and co-opting other countries. Let's see. Direct attacks involve physical actions that reach the individuals targeted, such as assassination, assault, physical intimidation, unexplained or forced disappearances, and rendition, which is abduction or kidnapping. Long-distance threats include coercion by proxy, such as family intimidation, and digital threats like spyware. Mobility controls restrict individuals' ability to travel through actions like passport revocation or denial of consular services. And finally, co-opting other countries involves manipulating host country institutions, such as police or immigration authorities, to harass, detain, or transfer individuals, often through unlawful deportation or Interpol abuse. These tactics collectively form a comprehensive strategy aimed at silencing dissenting voices and maintaining control over diaspora communities. Unfortunately, this has just been increasing, and they are quite effective in doing so. Now, to combat transnational oppression, Freedom House's recommendations for at least host governments include, but are not limited to, establishing an official definition of transnational oppression to be used by all government agencies, as this is a relatively new term that was coined in the past few years, ensuring that law enforcement officials and personnel at key agencies are trained to recognize targeting of exiles and diasporas, actually understanding what transnational oppression looks like and being equipped with the tools to combat it at that level. As well as increasing outreach to communities known to be targets for transnational repression, and implementing additional vetting for extradition requests and Interpol notices, especially from governments known to engage in such repression. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a recent example of transnational oppression against Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers occurred during the mass cross-movement protests in San Francisco on November 15th in light of dictator Xi Jinping's attendance for the APEC summit. And youth activists and peaceful protesters were met with mass Chinese operatives and paid CCP counter-protesters who stole their banners, their materials, assaulted them, and fled the crime scene. And the incidents at the APEC summit protest are also described in the interviews I conducted, but on the left is a short video of SFT's executive director, Student for Free Tibet's executive director, Pema Doma, speaking on the CCP violence during the APEC summit protest.
On November 15th, what I experienced was something I had never experienced before in my life as a Tibetan American. One of these videos was about something which now we call as a car park incident, where 4 Tibetan students went to a public parking lot and held a banner in a non-violent form of protest. There were a group of about 10 to 15 CCP, what seems like organized group, who violently pulled the banner in a jerking motion, almost causing several students, university students, to fall off the 5th floor of the building. I remember I was at the protest when my phone rang, and it was a 20-year-old Tibetan American student with a voice of fear and panic I have never heard in a young person. He said, Acha Pema, which means older sister Pema, they just tried to pull us off the building. It was a level of fear and intimidation I've never experienced a young person conducting activism and protests here in the United States to have experienced.
All right, and regarding the interviews, for this project, I had the privilege of interviewing 3 inspiring youth activists, each representing a different movement. The first, Tela Soksang, a Tibetan youth activist and the grassroots coordinator for SFT, provided insights into the challenges faced by Tibetans today. Carmen Lau, a Hong Kong youth activist in London and former district councillor of Hong Kong who has since been exiled, shared her experiences of navigating transnational oppression, targeting Hong Kong democracy activists. And lastly, Subiki Senawaldi, an Uyghur youth activist and government and journalism student based in the DMV area, offered perspectives on the plight of Uyghurs subjected to China's repressive policies. And these interviews shed light on the diverse experiences and resilience of activists striving for freedom, and justice in the face of transnational oppression. Unfortunately, although I was only able to include a short clip from each of our interviews in this presentation for the sake of time, I plan to publish transcriptions to ensure that, with their consent, I plan to publish transcriptions to ensure that their voices and perspectives are fully representative and accessible to a wider audience, which is one of my goals for this project. And the following audio recording of Tilla is her partial response to the questions: in what ways have you personally experienced or witnessed transnational oppression targeting Tibetan freedom activists, either directly or indirectly? And can you describe any specific instances or incidents of harassment, surveillance, or intimidation that you or your fellow activists have encountered from agents or proxies of the Chinese government? And in the photo, this is actually a photo of Tilla like 2 days ago. She went to France, where Xi Jinping is also in attendance, and she was detained for this action. But has since been released. And she pulled a similar action during the APEC summit protest back in November, where she climbed a pole right outside Xi Jinping's hotel where they were meeting. And she was able to see like the transnational oppression and violence occurring on the ground from an aerial view. So she will share some of her perspective here.
There was also a kind of impromptu banner drop, non-technical. It didn't require planning, but some of these activists took a public route in this public parking garage up to the 4th or 5th story, and they deployed just with their hands, like no climbing involved. They deployed a banner that said like Xi Jinping, your time's up, something like that, dictator Xi, your time is up. And from below, from where the bottom of the banner is, a bunch of these like CCP thugs ran, and they jolted it so hard that those like 4 or 5 activists were nearly pulled right out of the building. Like they were nearly pulled to their deaths. And I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that their intention was to severely harm them or kill them. You can't, of course we can't read their minds, but I personally think that they had zero regard for the human life at stake, and they were solely motivated by the CCP orders, right?
All right, and now the following audio recording of Carmen Lau is her response to the question: can you speak to the importance of solidarity and collaboration among different diaspora communities affected by China's repression, such as Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, with her being Hong Konger herself, and advocating for human rights and democracy?
I think as what we've been doing, like what Tibetans and Hong Kongers and Uyghurs have been doing together, it's quite obvious that it's important for us to have collaboration, because we are facing the same repression from the same regime, CCP, and they've been using similar tactics towards different communities as well, and we've known it. Like, for example, from experience from the Hong Kong community, we knew that what they've been doing to Tibetans and also Chinese and also the Uyghurs. So we will take extra cautiousness on the Hong Kong diaspora. Currently, we are the newest diaspora comparatively, and I've always been grateful that cross movement allies has been sharing their experiences towards not only transnational repression but also other issues, and how, for example, how do we navigate better in the UN or in the international community? How do we target our? How do we figure out who our allies are? Which actually we always learn from you guys, where if there's anything else that we could do better, and also collaborations, I would say, is one of the quite important measures that we should do, because simply you could, it's obvious to tell that having more helps from outside our community is always important, especially in outside our home country. So there's been a lot of cross movement efforts happening. APEC summits, protests is one of the example, but also a lot of the joint statements or policy advocacy efforts in Washington, DC, and also in London. You could see that it's always important to have more than one community, more than one diaspora to speak up on China in order to like push the host country's government to do something.
And lastly, the following audio recording of Speaking an Uyghur Youth Activist is her response to the question, looking ahead, what do you envision for the future of the Uyghur freedom movement and the struggle against transnational repression, and what steps do you believe are necessary to safeguard the rights and freedoms of Uyghurs both in occupied East Turkestan and abroad?
So there's I know that China the rise of their surveillance,
Right.
not just internet, but they have such information that they can look at it in any country, whether it be indirect or indirect means. So repression is all lies. Even there is trends of that. At the same time, these countries will always have issues and they will accept to target back. It's just, we have to come together communities and raise this issue. And in order to the legislation to combat this issue. Steps that are necessary to safeguard the rights of Uyghurs in both Turkestan and abroad is to first, talk about the issue. How are people going to know? People going to talk because they feel love the issue. So the first step is critical awareness and inclusion. And is to protect and communicate actively and consistently and movement, right? And then is to take action through policy. So, first we educate ourselves on the issue, we protest for it, we bring other groups involved in it, and then third, we try to get making action happen if you think about it in a more political science lens. So necessary is awareness.
And then I have one more slide, but I will say that I think we think of transnational oppression as something that's far from us, or something that we only see in like textbooks or that's read on the news. But even at Harper, I remember when I was tabling for Amnesty International back in January, I met the first Uyghur student I met on campus, and he came up to me saying that he would love to join our Amnesty chapter, but unfortunately he wants to go back to East Turkestan, or Xinjiang as he called it. He wants to go back home and he has family back home, and joining a human rights organization that is critical of the Chinese government, it would put him and his family at risk. So because of that, even on our own campus, we have cases of transnational repression. Yeah. And in conclusion, the pervasive reach of China's transnational repression, transnational repression tactics extends beyond its borders, targeting dissenting voices among Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, and even, of course, it extends beyond it, Taiwanese Chinese dissidents. I specifically chose to highlight these three communities because they're all striving for freedom right now from the Chinese government, and I had met all three of these youth activists in a cross-movement action camp over the summer that were willing to do this. But yeah, through this examination, it becomes very clear that these repressive policies not only violate fundamental human rights, but also undermine the principles of democracy and freedom of expression. And as we reflect on the insights shared by the youth activists and the urgent need for international solidarity, it is imperative that we continue to advocate for the rights and freedoms of all individuals and continue to raise our voices about transnational oppression. Thank you.
So you'd be able to take some questions in Dechen? A few minutes for questions. Any questions for Dechen?
I know it took a lot of time, but yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
When it comes to the question of Tibetans in China, I was wondering about something what you said to me about that. would there be a way to kind of reconcile the two where China needs to build dams so they can provide power to other citizens? Being respectful of the Tibetans' needs and other concerns, or is it like one or the other? One side could win while the other doesn't.
That's a great question. I think I like to answer questions like that. There's always a possibility of some sort of middle ground, not like neutrality, but the idea that there is like a balance agreement that can be met like through dialogue. But unfortunately, like the way you phrased that question, I think you said like, is there a way that China can do it without being disrespectful to the native indigenous Tibetans that have been there? And I would say no, there is not, because China has the way that like our land has been occupied, illegally occupied and colonized for more than 60 years. It goes like it violates basic human rights and it's completely disrespectful. There isn't a way for us to even like, I don't know, have that element of respect. And even like, I even wonder how willing the Chinese government would be to like adhere to some sort of like negotiation with them, because if you look at like the peaceful protests that are happening inside Tibet, and it's very difficult to even raise your voices inside Tibet because of like all the violations and all the ways the Chinese government can arrest you and quite literally kill you and force like implement forced disappearance. But in the videos where they're like peacefully protesting, as you call it, Tibetans, indigenous Tibetans are sticking out their thumbs, and that isn't even like asking, like that's not necessarily peacefully protesting, but it's quite literally like pleading with the Chinese government and like local officials not to do their land, to not forcefully displace them. So I would say that the engagement there isn't a way regarding the building of the hydropower dam, but I think there is a way forward through dialogue with getting more autonomy and independence for our country, and I do believe that Tibet will be free.
You know, one last question for you, Dechen. What are your future plans?
Oh, that's a good question. No.
My question for everybody.
Okay. So I'm actually graduating this month and like next week now. But I'm planning to transfer to Georgetown to study international politics at their School of Foreign Service. And I don't know exactly what I want to do like career-wise, but somewhere in the arena of like human rights advocacy work, or like possibly like public or foreign service. Yeah. Thank you.
Moving right along, we'll move on to our next speaker.
Dr. Bowman's, did we tell everyone about the refreshments being offered?
Thank you, Zane, for calling it to our attention. Yes, we do have refreshments. You can open up the plastic on that.
Can I start or should I? Everyone? Okay.
Yeah, you can begin, Kay, once you're ready.
Okay.
All right. I guess I get
A
started.
little bit of everyone's kind of shuffling for a second. And then we'll
Okay.
settle down. All right.
Okay. So my presentation is titled Migration, Displacement, and Adaptation, Communicating to the Climate Crisis. So I'm talking about the effects of climate change on global migration. So for my capstone project, I decided to create a climate migration guide. I decided to create a sort of toolkit or one-to-one explainer of the climate migration crisis. So the first part is about climate projections. So what's going to happen with the climate migration crisis, how it's going to happen. And then past and present, so what's been happening in the climate crisis, how it's already started at this point. And how we need science communication in this crisis. So we need culturally competent science communication and to really navigate this crisis. So first, I'll give a quick overview of what's going on with the current migrant crisis. So at the moment, climate migration takes the form of internal displacement. Internal displacement basically means people are moving from one region within their country to another because the areas that they live in have become unlivable due to natural disasters and just climate change conditions. The reason that we don't really see international climate migration as much is because it's really difficult to track. Part of that is because international migration at the moment, a lot of people are putting economic reasons as the reason for their migration, but really the underlying cause might be climate change because they don't have as many great crop yields because of climate change, which is then leading them to put economic reasons for why they moved. Another reason is that people are putting climate change as a factor for why they're moving, but not necessarily the sole reason for why they're moving. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, it's kind of hard to see, but in 2022, we had 32.6 million internal displacements. So that's the highest figure in a decade. And then if you look at the map at the top, 8.7 million people at the end of 2022 remained internally displaced. So the reason that these internal displacements are occurring more heavily is because climate change is causing these natural disasters to become more frequent, more unpredictable, and more unstable. So internal displacements are projected to rise, unfortunately. The World Bank's latest report projects that if we don't do as great of a job of actually mitigating the effects of climate change, 216 million people will have to be internally displaced by 2050. If we do a better job of actually mitigating climate change's effects, it'll be about 44 million people. So in either instance, internal displacement is going to occur and this crisis is going to happen. The scarier part is that permanent mass international displacement is likely to occur and it's already started happening. So if you look at the island of Tuvalu, it's a small island nation in the Pacific. And they have about 11 islands, but already because of rising sea levels, they've already lost 2 islands. And you can see here the foreign minister of Tuvalu, he decided to bring awareness to rising waters by giving the speech at COP26, where he's standing in those rising waters. And so because the islands will likely cease to exist in the future, the government of Tuvalu, they decided to sign a contract with the government of Australia so that 280 citizens can migrate in each year because their island nation will cease to exist, unfortunately. So as we saw in the case of Tuvalu, communities that contribute the least to global climate change are having to bear the worst consequences. We can see this globally through indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are some of the best at mitigating climate change, but they're unfortunately the ones that have to bear the worst and suffer the worst consequences. Indigenous communities protect about 80% of the world's biodiversity, and we depend, as humanity depends on biodiversity for our survival. It gives us access to food and advancements in medicine. And also land management is significantly better in indigenous lands. They're better for the soil, they're better for the ecosystem. And so the reason they're able to do that is because they have a reciprocal relationship with the land. And unfortunately, that's the opposite to what a lot of Western societies have and carry, which is extractive, exploitative systems that led us into this mess in the first place. So despite being really great at mitigating climate change effects, indigenous communities still have to deal with issues of land rights and becoming displaced. So I know I've talked about this as an international issue, but we already have an example of this happening in the US. In Isle de Jean Charles, which is an island in Louisiana, there's an indigenous community that had lived there for generations, but because of rising sea levels, which were accelerated by an oil drilling project nearby, they were forced to be resettled by the US government to a different nearby community in Louisiana. And the problem with this situation is that the indigenous community here, they didn't really have a say in what happened to the future of their community. So when they were resettled, they didn't really get to have powwow spaces like they wanted. They didn't have access to community centers, and they were just forced into wherever the US government resettled them. So there's essentially a communication breakdown. And as we're talking about science communication, we have to remember that we have to include the communities that are most vulnerable in the decision-making process. And another issue with climate change is the science communication isn't really strong in the US. And one of the issues that we deal with in the United States is skepticism. So when it comes to talking to skeptics, John Cook was featured in this book, The Persuaders. He talked about the tactics that we should use when we want to talk to skeptics. And a lot of us are taught that we should counter misinformation with more correct information. And the problem with that is that actually just causes people that are misinformed to become more resolute in the fact that they're right. And so the better thing to do is instead disprove the trustworthiness of their sources. So the way to do that is if you prime people with weaker forms of misinformation, so if you show them cigarette ads from the 60s and you show them the tactics they're using to show that cigarettes are healthy, then after that, if you show them incorrect climate science, then they're more likely to pick up on the tactics that that misinformation is using. And then another issue with climate change is actually getting people to care. So a lot of scientists and content experts, they have a tendency to talk in really abstract and academic terms. The problem with that is it's not really accessible. So people don't really understand what they're talking about. And another issue is that scientists, they tend to speak to, they don't speak to their audience's values, actually. So an example would be American farmers, if you use the word climate change around them, they don't react well to that. But if you start saying we should stay away from monocultures, we should have a variety of crops, we should start shifting away from fertilizers, pesticides, they react really well to that. So you have to change your terminology and messaging to your audience if you want to get through to them. And then a lot of scientists don't like to hear this, or content experts in general, academics. You have to be personable. people like it when you're authentic. Sorry, but yeah, people like it when you're authentic, and people learn better when there's a personal connection. So it's okay to have your own stories weaved into the climate science that you're talking about. And then finally, when it comes to climate change, we talk about it in terms of global terms. And yes, it's true, like rising temperatures are going to occur around the world, but really people respond well if you talk locally. So if you say water is going to become more expensive because there's more droughts, or if you say it's harder to tell when it's safe to go outside because of unpredictable weather, that's stuff that people will see day to day, rather than the temperatures are rising globally by this much. So as part of the Capstone project, I decided it's important to communicate with people. So I interviewed 5 people around the world, and this is one of the interviews I did. So this is Maria. She's a lecturer and researcher at the National University of Costa Rica, and she was researching how climate adaptation manifests in coastal communities and fisheries in Costa Rica. So this clip specifically is about how she changed her communication style when going out and doing her research.
To understand the audience, this is a community. And you have also going to the community to some research. And at least I did that about the history of the community, just to understand which kind of topics are sensitive. So it's not only that I'm going to change the language that I'm going to use, I'm still talking about climate change, but with different kind of words. I'm not going to start talking about this kind of technical issues because that's not the moment. And they don't care about that. That's not the thing that we need to discuss. So I think that's important for researchers, for policymakers also, because they will try, to create these different proposals for communities without considering the community.
And then another interview I did was with Taylor. She's a student at the University of Guam. She's also part Indigenous Chamorro, and she tries to work on conservation efforts on the island. And in this clip, she talks about how difficult it is for the Indigenous community and the community at large in Guam to be able to do conservation work.
So these small concentrated areas of endemic species habitat, especially those that are critically endangered, they're occupied by military bases, so we have to go through so many hoops to try and even do research on preserving these species. And yeah, like a lot of our sites where we have historic digs and remains of our moral ancestors are on these sites. And it's hard to access and it's hard to do conservation work because of the limitation on civilian military access. And one of the biggest issues with Guam and the environment is that the people really don't have a strong say in what happens. We can protest, we can try to be present at public hearings, we can write petitions, but besides that, it's not that effective, and like all these different things.
So what I really want to stress, about what Taylor said at the end there about what I want to stress is what she said about people on the island don't really have a say as to what happens to the island. And when we're thinking about communicating with different communities, we have to allow communities to have the say in what happens to them. So this is actually a good model. I know I've viewed a lot of like negative examples at you, but this is actually a positive model that we can start using that's collaborative. So the National Science Foundation, they committed just last year to $30 million to create the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge and Science. So 2/3 of the scientists involved are Indigenous, and the center's main goal is to study climate change's effects on food security as well as preserving cultural heritage. And the great thing about this model is that Indigenous scientists are actually working with Western scientists to combine their knowledge, and then Indigenous communities can have a say as to what happens to their community rather than always being the ones that are studied. So when we're thinking about the future of climate change, I want us to be aware of a few key things. So we have to be aware of historical injustices. We have to adjust the way we talk about climate change, especially scientists and content experts. They have to change the way they talk about it to different audiences. We also have to change the way we communicate with vulnerable communities and with one another. And we should incorporate ideas that we're not familiar with. So when it came to Indigenous scientists, a lot of them weren't listened to because it didn't fit the standards of Western science, but their ideas were working. So we need to start incorporating ideas that are working that maybe aren't traditionally accepted. And then most of all, I wanted to center the stories and the voices of climate migrants. We want to create a better and fairer future for them because that's the least that we owe them. So.
We have some questions for Kay.
Yeah.
How do you foresee, especially in America, a change in corporations lobbying against environmental issues?
Yeah. So that's a really frustrating thing about doing this research is that the people who are most culpable are not taking responsibility and we're not actually getting them to make any changes. So I think what I talked about communication, like it only goes so far with like being able to teach the general public about the future of climate migration and climate change is effective, but if it's not actually affecting the people that are really going to make big decisions, then yeah, it's not really effective. So what I hope for is that more corporations are taking responsibility and changing their policies, and then governments follow suit and actually regulate them. But I'm trying to remain hopeful, but I'm also trying to be realistic. Yeah, I know that's not a really happy answer. Yeah. But
So one similarity I saw between your and Dechen's presentations, these transnational solidarities. So I was wondering, how did you even get in touch with these students that were part of your
oh, actually, Professor Johnson's right here. I talked to him about one of the researchers. I also talked to Professor Brett Fulkerson Smith, I think that's his name. He connected me to the Student University of Guam. And then I actually didn't include this, but I interviewed my grandmother because she has lived in the same town her whole life in Japan. And she's seen how consumerism has changed the town and like industry has changed the town. There's a lot of deforestation in the area. So I basically tried to find as many connections as I could through Harper and then personal connections as well. Other questions?
Okay, one last question.
Oh.
What are your future plans?
Oh, right. Okay, so I committed to DePaul. I'm transferring there and hopefully double majoring. We'll see if I can make it happen. In public policy with a focus in environmental policy, and then international studies with a focus in global Asian affairs. Yeah.
And in just a few weeks, she's actually giving a presentation to youth activists on how to avoid activist burnout. So that was one of her things she was doing as her service learning project that she did. So tremendous. Thank you. Yeah, I got it. You can help yourself with some cookies or some water. We can get things ready here in just a moment.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm not allowed to eat this, but thank you very much.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's yeah, it's dark. Unless it's completely dark. I'll get it screen up here. You want to start with that?
I'm going to start.
Okay, and I'll try like.
For my presentation, I'm going to talk about discovering different ways that we can conserve our biodiversity, specifically here in the United States. Everybody talks about all the issues that goes on around the world, deforestation with the orangutans, for example, or climate change that's affecting, everyone knows about, like, you know, the polar bears. And truly everyone wants to help, but we can't because, well, some people can't because they don't have the resources, or honestly, some people don't have the effort to even try. So here for my presentation, I'm going to show different people and how they can, how they have helped the biodiversity, specifically here in the United States, right outside in their community, to show that it's possible for all of us to make a change.
On July 9th of 2022, I took my first. My family and I were confronted.
Is there a way I could turn up the volume? I'll just let it play again. You get some clients.
On July 9th of 2022, I took my first trip to the Great Smoky Mountains and witnessed a heart. My family and I were confronted by outside of the hotel in the center of Ghana. As cold as it was to see them, it shattered my heart to think of the reasons why they're in the middle of the city instead of their natural habitat. That got me thinking, what could have caused it? How do we prevent it? I decided to create a short film to document my research and hands-on experience with the peaceful creatures. Stuart K. Allison, a biology professor at Knox College in Illinois, wrote a book called Ecological Restoration and Environmental Change. In his book, he mentions the beginnings of restoration. Paraphrase, the study of restoration began in the late 18th century as European foresters designed experimental plantings to improve forest health and limit damaging flooding. He also mentions a similar experimental approach that took root in the rangelands in Utah and eastern Oregon.
My name is Andrea Wall. I'm a 73-year-old retired occupational therapist. I decided I wanted to do something in my community and help habitat.
I spoke with Andrea Wall, formerly known as the conservation champion in her community. According to the Royal Society, approximately 60% of the total species, mammal and bird species, has occurred in just the United States being one of them. I asked her on her thoughts about how America is dealing with the issue of maintaining their variety of species.
Not well. Yeah. I think it's better with this administration than the prior one. But in 2016, when I saw how much difficulty the pollinators were having, that's part of the reason why the Trail Project has 2 pollinator gardens.
Could I know a little bit about what inspired you to begin Friends of Faneuil Creek Headwaters?
And we is that there was water that was above the trail because we started getting these torrential downpours as climate change. We had to have a non-profit organization in order to get grant money, and that's where the Oregon Wildlife Foundation comes in because they manage our grant money and our donations. We're just focusing on this project and they take care of the rest.
Andrea's mission has been to remove invasive species in Oregon, such as the Himalayan blackberry and English ivy, and replace them with native plants, the same plants that the indigenous people used to cook with for medicinal purposes. Replanting these plants helps the native pollinators such as mason bees, rabbits, coyotes, etc. I also spoke with Sarah Stratton, a speech-language pathologist who's been involved in multiple projects involving amphibians and reptiles in Oregon. One of the most eye-opening experiences she had was how there was a numerous amount of frog roadkill in Portland due to the rainy weather and cars driving through. In an effort to save the frog population, she was involved in a project that helped build a highway underpass to allow the amphibians a safe passage. The National Wildlife Federation claims that by conserving wildlife, we're ensuring that future generations can enjoy our natural world. In Japanese culture, people hold that claim close to them. Stuart K. Allison mentioned how in Japan, for at least 2,000 years, Shinto priests have encouraged the maintenance of forests near their temples. Written in Virgil's Georgics, which was made in 30 BCE, some pages can be read as a description of the need for the people to care for trees as an early form of restoration.
Hi, I'm Lori Makosa. I'm a student of animal ecology at Iowa State University, the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and
I interviewed Laura on behalf of her experience in Japan and the differences in biodiversity there versus here.
So I've been to Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, Namanikawa, which is a smaller town, and then Nara. More than anything, I think the most stark difference between the two places is that just how clean Japan can be, just from an aesthetic perspective, just Japan is a lot cleaner. I noticed that They have a lot of greenery in some of their buildings, just growing inside in a way we have never seen here in the US. I do know that according to Shinto, they probably do regard a lot of wildlife and the natural area as sacred in a way.
So again, just restating, all of us can make a change, and my discovery through this with interviews and reading books and using internet, it was very helpful. So I would advise anyone here to do the same thing, talk to people, get involved. Again, like some people said that you can create a leaf pile outside in your backyard, and that allows critters to hide in there, or have like a feeder in your backyard because it helps the migrating bird. And there are so many other ways that we can all help contribute, literally right outside our backyard. And it was great discovering those ways and talking to people from Oregon. Thank you.
That's for Michelle.
So about this leaf pile, how exactly does it work?
It's like in the fall time, you can just sweep up, because a lot of people top their leaf piles. You can have it like in the corner of your backyard, and it allows like snakes and other animals that still haven't hibernated yet to burrow in there in the winter, or like as it's transitioning into winter time.
Interesting. My mom just got that.
Oh, nice.
I hope it's gonna be a lot like the previous one.
Can you explain a little bit about, because you did service learning that was related to this. We saw a little bit in the
Yeah.
video clip. Can you maybe explain some of the things that you did in your service learning project?
So with my service learning, something that I did was, I mean, the typical like cleaning like the area wherever they were, but also it was very fascinating to see people come in with the animals that were injured or needed rescue. And it was interesting to hear like all the stories, like, oh, my dog almost got to this raccoon, or like there was like a lot of babies and stuff. Also a misconception that people always think is they see babies like in their backyard, like whether it be baby squirrels or something, and people are like, I need to rescue that. No, the first thing you need to do is make sure that their mother is there, because their mother is going to be their best provider. Yeah.
Excellent. And we heard
For animals. Yeah.
at the end of the video, you said the journey continues. So tell us where that journey is going to continue for you next.
So hopefully I'll be going to Southern Illinois University. I'll be studying either veterinary medicine, animal ecology, or zoology. So I'm still interested in pursuing this field. Yeah.
We have our final presenter tonight.
Oh, you make a interview or just American Sign? Yeah. Oh, okay. I just hope I'm gonna be speaking in such a way that not only will I can be able to understand me, but I hope I'm not gonna end up making you really kind of going overdrive just to cover what I'm saying. Hope I'm gonna be able.
Okay, Zain, let's see if we can get yours. So Zain Raza is going to be our next
I have
presenter.
to really fast.
Okay, thank you. The interpreters are really good.
Yeah.
Good.
Alrighty, wish me luck.
All right, Zing, I wish you luck.
Alright, hello everyone. This is my capstone project, Quranic Arabic, necessity or tradition. This is going to be a lot different from the other projects and where they were socio-cultural and socio-political, but mine is going to be socio-religious, if you know what I mean. So, a little bit about myself. So, first of all, my name is Zain Raza. I'm 20 years old and I'm in my 4th semester at here. I'll be graduating at the end of this very semester, just like, if I recall correctly, Michelle. And as you can see from the presentation, I'm pursuing the global studies distinction of the social capstone project. And a little bit about myself that you don't know of at the top of your head. I am a first-generation 12er Shia Muslim American born to 2 parents who immigrated here from Pakistan. Quick side note here. When I say 12er, it means that as a Shia Muslim, I believe in the sanctity of the 12 Imams in Islam. 12 people who were given special God-gifted knowledge that will help them lead other people in their ways of living and becoming the best people they can be. Additionally, we, as 12er Shias, we believe in the occultation of the 12th Imam. He's currently in kind of a wave, you know what I mean, in occultation, and someday he will return one day to be able to restore justice. All right, let's go. So the issue behind the project that I wanted to do for Social Capstone is that when I was reading the Quran, when I was very young, it would be in Arabic almost all the time. And this made me wonder, when we read the Quran in Arabic, is it like required as in something we do because if we don't, it's like fundamental violation, or is it something we do because it's out of tradition? I respect the Quran. And at the same time, this made me wonder, is this okay to do in other languages, like not just like in English, but also in other languages like Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Vietnamese, the Navajo language, or even Tibetan, assuming Tibetan is a language? So this is one thing I've kind of wondered, because when I've seen many Muslim scholars, some say that it's allowed, some say that it's not allowed and issued fatwas against it. And I've also heard of other scholars that say it's not necessarily prohibited, but at the same time, it's not exactly something you should be doing. So basically, it's makruh, not recommended. Oh my goodness, that's a very beautiful picture. Okay, so some goals that I wanted to have because I completed this project in the form of a research paper is that I wanted to give my take on this uncommon issue as a Shia Muslim American student in the wake of the 21st century. And also because when it comes to discussions about religious texts, we often talk about the Bible and the Torah, but I don't believe it's really the case that the Quran is talked about as much compared to the others. So I want to bring this out there to help foster our dialogue. Additionally, I wanted to have an opportunity to talk about the Quran and highlight its very importance because it has a lot of interesting secrets and a lot of other knowledge, wisdom, and experience that we're still discovering to this very day, even though it originated in the 7th century. And lastly, I hope to raise awareness of this particular issue to other people, especially those who don't practice the Muslim faith. Because even if you don't read the Quran out of your own volition, I hope you'll be able to learn a thing or two about it. Because it has just as much importance as the other religious texts. Alrighty. So what inspired me to do this project? Well, back in 2009, 2010, or 2011, when I was about 6 or 7, I would remember reading the parts of the Quran in some kind of workbook with my mom. Initially, I didn't really feel like doing it, but when I look back at that very day as a Shia Muslim American, I'm so grateful that I was able to have an opportunity to see something that's not in English. In this case, it was Arabic. When I read the Quran, I would often wonder what it meant. So when I took a look at the English translations, it made such striking and smooth points in such a way that I thought that J.R.R. Tolkien himself wrote. But obviously he did not, because the Quran came way before he did. So because I was very, very mesmerized by the points made in the Quran, it made me wonder, why do we read the Quran in Arabic? And why can't we just simply rely on the English translations? So I decided to do my capstone project on this because when I was talking to my mentor, Professor Tamajan, as well as Professor Fallow and Dr. Bowman, they all said to me that the Quran is not a topic that's talked about very often. And so I decided to help fill in this niche. All right. Oh boy, now the nitty gritty. So when I was doing my research on the translation of the Quran, I discovered some pretty interesting facts. I'm going to need to look at the screen just to make sure I don't get anything wrong. So the Ibn Hajj al-Shirazi, a piece of writing about the Quran, was translated into Argosian. Okay, then you're going to translate that. So Argosian, an old Turkish dialect. This would become important when it comes to translations of the Quran, because not only was it that people could understand the Quran a lot more, but also it would help people in other areas, whether it be in the area of Turkey or groups of people living in the Arabian Peninsula, or even in areas as far as the Indian subcontinent. This would become very important in the future. But even then, it surprised me that the second fact that I've learned about when it comes to the translation of the Quran is that when China had access to it, I hope I'm going to be talking about China in a way that's not going to be disrespectful to you, Dechen. So when I learned about how groups of people in China got access to the translations of the Quran, it actually happened in the 20th century. Not the 7th century, not the 8th century, not the 9th century, and not the 10th century, but the 20th century, during a time of World War I and World War II. This very much surprised me because I thought that when it comes to translations of the Quran, that I thought China had access, especially during the time of the Silk Road, a transcontinental network of trade routes known for exchanging many different goods and services between China, Europe, as well as the Middle East. So this really hit me hard because it turns out the reason that China even had access to those translations were because of the work of a real estate tycoon who made a publishing company and decided to sell copies of translations of the Quran. This really resonated with me because I remember Dr. Momin talking with me about how he was in China in the northeast section near North Korea, and he would often spend time with them because he would buy their meat because it was halal, and he wanted to make sure that he would get meat that was known to be properly taken care of so he doesn't get ill. I'm glad you told me about that, Dr. Bowman. And lastly, there's one ruling that I've discovered when it comes to translations of the Quran. So according to the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, a Muslim scholar that my family and I follow as Shia Muslims, I discovered there was a ruling about translations of the Quran in one of his books called Islamic Laws According to the Fatwas of His Eminence. It says, and I quote, touching the writing of the Quran, i.e., making a part of the body come into contact with the writing of the Quran, for someone who does not have wudu is unlawful. However, if the Quran is translated into another language, then touching the translation is permissible. So basically what I've learned is not only is it that translations are actually okay to do, but also when it comes to the Arabic that we do, we often want to treat it with respect because that was the language in where the Quran was revealed. However, if it was translated into some other language, like say Spanish or Chinese or Russian or Vietnamese, maybe even the Navajo language, turns out that if you touch it even without wudu, then it's not going to be very disrespectful. Also, quick side note about the term wudu. Wudu is a term that we use to describe a state of spiritual cleanliness that we achieve when we do a specific cleansing ritual in a sink, provided that the sink and the water too is reasonably clean. All right, now this one's gonna be a bit of a doozy. Hope you'll bear with me. So the fact that I've done this social capstone project, even if it's not exactly the same as what Kai and Dechen and Michelle did, since it's religious based, that I hope that when it comes to this sort of issue that you'll be more likely to look at the Quran, especially when it comes to the translations, because Arabic is not a language that all of us would want to learn first base, but I hope that if you want to learn about the Quran, then you can use the translations, because then it won't be disrespectful. Unless you're using the Quran to prove false ideas, which unfortunately was very commonplace post 9/11. But I'm sure you all won't do that because we're all here to learn. And another thing that I wanted to accomplish with the fact that I completed this capstone project, just like all the others, is that I wanted to change my perspective to personal projects. I don't think the term project is something that inspires the most intensive enthusiasm from you guys, because you often think about how projects is something you do just to make sure your instructor or teacher or professor won't give you a bad grade. So I'm glad I was able to do this project, because now I realize that projects don't have to be a means to an end. It can be the end itself, like a game. Unless I considered the fact that I already may have done a personal project, because I gave a copy of my little project, a self-help guide, to Professor Tibetans, and she was helping me think of ways to do the capstone project. So if you're interested, which you're probably not, but if you are interested, I recommend taking a look at that self-help guide that I made and sent to Professor Tibetans. It's very helpful and helped out an entire athletic team and one international reader in England that actually printed out the whole thing in paper. And also because I put in some very insightful things into that self-help guide that I got from the Quran. So that's another thing that I've accomplished, even if it's not explicitly stated there. And lastly, I hope that I will be able to increase my confidence in participating in discourse, because right now we're all talking about how, well, not now, but with the other presenters, that we were able to learn a thing or two about the world. So I hope that with the fact that I've done this capstone project about the Quran, that it'll give me more confidence when it comes to basically learning a thing or two about the world, because I always thought that you had to have a degree to participate. So unless I was on the same stage as like Dr. Bowman or Professor Halil or Professor Tamajian or any other instructor with a PhD or something, that's the only kind of people who could participate and vice versa. But now I realize even if I do participate and I end up doing something wrong, it's not the end of the world, because at the end of the day, if there's one thing I've learned, is that even if we don't know everything, like I'm sure that from the past presenters like Dechen and Kai and Michelle, they've done really good jobs in their projects, but even then, that doesn't mean that their knowledge about it is perfect, 100%. We're all here to learn, and I'm glad that I was able to help achieve that objective with the social capstone course with my very project, chronic Arabic. Tradition or requirement. Thank you very much.
I think you just proved that, and all these speakers today, I think really proved you don't need to have a degree to be up here, right? So there's some great minds here among the capstone students, so.
Okay, now do you all have any questions? I'll be more than happy to answer it.
Just because I feel like, well, I want to be proud. Is wudu, is that the same thing as when you bless, meat to make it halal?
Not exactly. When you do wudu, you're at a sink and you pour water on your hand and you wipe parts of your body in a very specific way. When it comes to slaughtering meat, on the other hand, if I recall correctly from what my parents told me, since they're very knowledgeable about Islam, is that when it comes to slaughtering animals, you want to make sure you say Allahu Akbar before finally beheading the animal in such a way that it won't hurt the animal. Because unfortunately, between you guys and even me in this very room, I kind of learned what kind of horrible stuff to go through. Have you ever heard of this documentary film called Dominion from 2018? I recommend you take a look at it. It's very renowned and kind of saddening because of the way they show the animal being processed in inhumane way. And you know what made this experience even more interesting? I watched it right on the day of Thanksgiving. I couldn't attend Thanksgiving dinner with my family, but I can still make it more meaningful by doing something that helps challenge me. So I hope I was able to answer your question, Michelle. I think that's your name, right? Michelle? Okay. Do any of you have any questions about the Quran?
About his presentation?
Or anything in general, if I may ask? Oh.
As you were reading the Quran, just besides Arabic, are you noticing anything that can't be translated or is lost in translation?
In my experience, I have not experienced anything that has been lost. Usually when it comes to the Arabic, it's often always there, but when it comes to lost translations, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Maybe when it comes to lost knowledge, but I've kind of unlikely. So either there was a lost translation, I think there's probably some application from it that we've already embedded, so maybe it might not. At least that's my experience. So I believe that there are no more questions. unless I-
One last question.
Just got one.
Okay.
What are you doing after this? What's the next things for you? What's the next steps? What
Well,
are you gonna
first
do
of all,
after
the honors
graduation?
convocation.
Well, that's coming up. That's in the near future.
As for my future plans, I'm planning on transferring to North Central College, although I'm waiting on a bunch of other offers. I don't know if they're gonna be rejected or worse, withdrawn, but I'll see what happens if everything falls. But until then, I think I'm gonna plan on transferring to North Central College, pursuing a major in actuarial science.
Actual science, all right, very cool. All right, thank you, Zane. Thank you for. Ready to head on up to our honors convocation. Thank you all for coming today. I'm gonna leave you with the, if I can get to the commercial. Gonna leave you with some words from the legendary Billy Weathers and wish